We can chat about it live.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well on this fabulous Wednesday in March. I'm Julie Gunderson, Senior Reliability Advocate at Gremlin.
And I'm Jason Yee, Director of Advocacy at Gremlin.
And we were just talking about a little bit of chaos going on in my household this morning, which I'll spare you all of the details. But we're very excited to be with you today. We've got some interesting things actually to talk about today. And first, we really wanted to chat with everybody about the GitHub incident that happened just 6 days ago on the 17th. Jason, do you want to kick us off here?
Yeah. So this one was interesting. GitHub, pretty large outage, right? It affected, you can see here on their status page, GitHub Actions. So if you're using GitHub Actions for automation, API requests, which is never good, code spaces, GitHub operations or Git operations, issues, so people couldn't interact with projects and file issues, packages, GitHub pages, pull requests, webhooks, basically everything. And it's worth noting that this wasn't just the only outage. Actually, this was the primary outage. After this, they had some other, I think they were knock-on outages or incidents. It's kind of unclear because until they do a write-up, we won't really know. But my suspicion is they were fixing things, trying to implement some of what they had discovered, some remediations for that, and those probably led to other issues.
Yeah, and one of the things, if you go to the status page, you can see all of the details on when they found the incident, the updates, which I'm really, again, very impressed with GitHub for the consistent updates throughout the entire thing. So thank you. You are doing a great job with that. It took actually like 4 minutes, under 2 hours, 1 hour and 56 minutes to identify what the issue was. And then after that, it was remediated in about 45 minutes after identification. But, this isn't the first incident that we have seen with GitHub. But one of the other things that I really, really do appreciate about the way GitHub does business is they put together these availability reports, and they launch these at the beginning of each month. And you can find those on the GitHub blog, which I am popping that link in the comments for you all to take a look at if you're interested, because we'll definitely be talking about the follow-up from this report. But there was another incident in February, and this one was only 13 minutes in duration. And so, Jason, we were actually talking about this earlier because it had to do with integrity hashes and sub-resource integrity. And I think you and I went down some rabbit holes.
Yeah, this one's super interesting because as somebody that's been in tech for a long time, like I learned HTML back in the, early 90s. So, I was using Mosaic as a browser. Netflix had just come out. I moved to that. Like, that was super cool. And so HTML, like, for me, still sort of exists in that world. Like, I know the basics. For those who are like web developers keeping on top of things, this might not be new for you, probably isn't. But I didn't know that when you link out to resources, like if you're including a script, you can include the integrity attribute, which is a SHA hash. And so according to the specs, this can be SHA-256, which is the least secure, which is actually pretty darn secure, all the way up to a SHA, I think 512 is the largest that it'll take. But generally, you can include a hash for the resource that you're going out to fetch. And that ensures that if you're using things like a CDN or a third-party provider for whatever that resource is, you can ensure that you're getting the resource that you want and that it hasn't been changed on you. So really just securing your dependencies there. To dive into the incident, essentially what happened was during the build process for GitHub for a bunch of their stuff, it failed to trigger the process that would generate hashes and update those. So despite like updating a bunch of stuff, like it didn't have the right hashes. So when they pushed out the web application, the hashes were wrong. And that meant from users' browsers, the browsers were saying, go out and fetch this resource. Oh no, the hash doesn't match. This has clearly been messed with, so don't load it. And it meant that a bunch of the web application side for GitHub was completely broken because it was missing things like JavaScript and CSS and other things.
Well, and that's part of their safety protocol too, because they did say that their default behavior is to error rather than rendering script tags without integrities, right? So if that hash can't be found in the integrities file, then they just served up the 500 error pages. What I really thought was awesome about this is as soon as they noticed it, they rolled back to the previous deployment, and then that resolved the incident. And then since then, so they took this as an opportunity to learn, which we always love talking about. They added in those additional checks to the build processes to ensure that the integrities are accurate and complete. And then they also added the checks into the main JavaScript resources. So I thought that, you know, what we saw was a pretty short incident. It impacted the internet browser only, and they learned from it and are working to prevent that from happening in the future. But when we talk about all things reliability, what do you think are ways that we could have maybe looked at preventing this from happening in the beginning? Is what tests would we have even used?
Yeah, this is interesting, right? Because I think there's a number of points where we can at least monitor for these, right? Monitoring in your build pipeline, I'm sure that they had some sort of notification that builds failed, but at the same time, it got deployed. And so understanding and looking at when we're setting up our build pipelines, what sort of notifications and warnings do we have? And I think this is always the struggle, because as a developer, you know, builds are often super flaky. And so your number one thing is like, if a build fails, it's not that anything's gone wrong. It's just it builds flaky and you know, push the button to run it again. And I think that's the standard procedure for most folks, rather than spending that initial time to look into what happened, right? You just run it again. And depending on how things are set up, complex systems, sometimes that means that things get deployed when they maybe shouldn't be. So I think that's like the first thing that I would look at is what is your alerting and monitoring look like on your build system? Are you notified when things like this happen?
Yeah, and I mean, again, I just have to say hats off to GitHub, because the way they communicate, the way they share their learnings, they've done a great job of keeping everybody up to date.
Yeah. Now, I would say the second thing, actually, as I think more about it, would be, you know, the struggle with this is it was browser based, right? And so a lot of times that seems to be out of our hands, because it goes out to the user, you know, particularly for those of us in the SRE ops, DevOps space, we're often thought of as more as that back end. And so that front end stuff, what's happening in a user's browser, is often seen as beyond our control. So I wonder how much real user monitoring they had in place. That's another tool that everyone should look at. Having some sort of real user monitoring would have likely exposed this to understand what are users actually seeing, because it's getting pulled in on their browsers. So that's my other tip.
Well, I think that's great. If there's anybody from GitHub out there that's watching that would like to join us as a guest on the show to talk about any of this, please feel free to reach out to Jason or I. You can find us both on Twitter or at Gremlin. I'm Julie at gremlin.com, and Jason is JE at gremlin.com. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. With that, we have something kind of interesting we wanted to talk about today, which was the NPM packages and what went on with that, and kind of talking a little bit more about the deeper meaning of well, hacktivism, activism, however you want to look at it. But Jason, you want to talk a little bit about this to start us off?
Yeah, this one is actually really similar to that GitHub issue, particularly because it's about dependencies, right? Like, this is the world we live in with complex systems and modern software, is libraries and using other people's code and using other people's services and pulling them together. And none of us are really, that independent engineer or developer, like doing things on your own. We all have these connections. And so for this one in particular, comes sort of after a string of a bunch of NPM package issues. But this one in particular, Ray Evangelist, I don't really know how to pronounce their username, but that's their username on in the NPM world and on GitHub. Basically, there's a package that's used by a bunch of other systems. So I think it's Node IPC was the main one. And basically, as a form of protest, the primary maintainer of this, or the project maintainer, updated the code to initially look for where this package was being used. If your IP addresses were within Belarus or Russia, then what happened was it went out and it replaced as many files as it could within your system with a heart emoji. So that was extremely destructive. The maintainer then thought a little bit better about this, and rather than basically overwriting or deleting files that could be critical, they set it up so that it sent this text message or this text file to the desktop, which is also an interesting assumption that these NPM packages were only running on local computers. But you can read the text here. Basically, it's a message of peace, an anti-war message for what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine and the invasion there. So that's kind of where this left out, I think, is a bunch of people questioning what is the place of protests, and particularly as maintainers of open source projects that a lot of people use.
Yeah, and this isn't the first one that has happened this year either. So this is actually the second major protest, because there was a protest in January, the Colors and Fakers self-sabotage incident. And that was by the developer Mark Squires, because essentially he broke thousands of applications by introducing infinite loops within them, which goes to this broader conversation of really open source and who owns the code and what are the ethics involved and the considerations that we should be thinking about with open source. And then as you're a company that is using open source tools, what are the considerations? And, Jason, you and I were talking a little bit about ways to protect yourself from issues like this, but in trade-off, those things can hamper velocity. And so since you and I had the opportunity to chat about it, I thought it might be something that we'd like to talk with our viewers about.
Yeah, so larger than the discussion of whether politics should be in open source, brief aside, my opinion is that open source is all political. If you've ever been involved in any open source project, it's all political. But beyond that, in terms of reliability for yourself and your company or wherever you're at, the traditional method has been to basically grab that open source project library, have somebody review it, and then store it in your own package manager, right? And then whenever you're doing development, you tell all the developers you can't hit npm public, point everything to, npm.internal.r.org, whatever hostname you want to give it. And that's generally how you operate, is now you only use packages that have been approved by whoever that is, your IT or security or compliance organization within your company. And obviously that does have impacts, right? Because there's just such a wealth of open source projects and libraries and tools out there that anytime you need one of those, it means then you go to that compliance or security team and you beg them, like, can I have this, please? Please, sir, And then eventually 6 months later, they get around to reviewing it and they add it to the thing. And now you're unblocked, again, 6 months later or whatever it takes. And so it does slow things down, but it provides some reinsurance. The downside, of course, as well, is that when things like this happen, the updates may not just be protest code. They could be bug fixes and a bunch of other stuff rolled up in that. And now you're stuck because they're not going to approve it with the protest code, but you need those fixes. And you get in this weird stage of what open source do you use? How do you manage upgrades, et cetera?
Yeah. And then you get into the whole conversation of who owns what. So as part of the rabbit hole of investigating this, when we were looking at Mark Squires in the case of the colors situation, GitHub blocked his access to GitHub. And that is interesting because who owns the code?
Yeah, GitHub blocked his access. NPM rolled back to the previous version. And basically without that access, it means that they were between NPM and GitHub, the community decided that the last good version was pre-protest and this is where we're stuck and nobody can update it. And I don't know that when they blocked access that there was that communication of what are the community standards, what do we expect, what's required for you to regain access and become the maintainer of these things again. I think there were a lot of hasty decisions there and, done in the name of protecting the community, but I don't know, it's a tricky thing. Julie, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's first of all, I'm glad I'm the one that doesn't have to make these decisions, to be honest with you, because it's a double-edged sword that you can look at in context of larger conversations, because, there may be legitimate acts of protest, but who's to say those are legitimate? Who's to say those aren't? Who's to say the overall safety of certain things is more important than the protest? There's a much bigger conversation. And you just got me thinking that I'd really like to dive deep into the code of conduct and the rules to see where something like this may have actually been spelled out. And then there's not just all of that, but then you have to look and think about what's the reputation of the person, and are you willing to sacrifice your reputation in form of protest, which theoretically I think I would, but I don't know. I haven't had that opportunity present itself. So it's always easy to say what I would do until you're in that situation. But then the reputation of the rest of the community too, because a lot of folks were really unhappy, especially with this most recent one, not just the colors and fakers, but the one that we were just talking about, because this does actually have an impact on the rest of the open source community and how much organizations are willing to trust that. So I think that this is something that we could probably talk about for days on, and the implications are much larger than we could probably determine in our Wednesday site reliability chats. But what I would love to hear is what other people's opinions are, either in the comments. I know a lot of folks were commenting on last week's LinkedIn. So however you want to let us know, I think the conversation needs to be had. And I think that this is a conversation that almost needs to be decided by the community as a whole instead of a large organization.
Yeah, definitely needs more discussion, both in terms of the protests and, what we as engineers and software developers, what we have obligations to speak out about and how we do that and what's acceptable. Particularly also thinking that although the initial change on this was geofenced to Belarus and Russia, obviously we know that Russia is a huge place. I always like to emphasize to people that Russia spans 11 time zones, people, like 11, right? The US only has arguably 4, right? 5 if you count Alaska and Hawaii and other weird places, but that is massive. Europe has 3. So Russia is a huge place. You can't say that all Russians support this, that all Russians are like one massive block of, homogenous or people. So there's a notion of like, who are you affecting when you do something as large scale as this and as blanketed as this? So that's one thing. The other is obviously, when it comes down to it, we are site reliability chats. What do we do for reliability? Is the solution just to maintain our own repos on the side, as mentioned, and have security teams internal to our companies? What sort of other tools and solutions can we come up with to basically ensure that maybe people have the freedom to protest, but also that it doesn't break all of our systems in the process?
Absolutely. And there's where the conversation is. And, I think when you go back to this one too, it's about understanding the dependencies when you go back to this very specific one. So Liren called it out. He said, essentially, it's a supply chain attack impacting the NPM ecosystem due to the nested dependencies, Node, IPC, and Peace Not War. I have posted a link to his blog as well. But in our last few minutes of the chat, I do want to move on a little bit and talk about an update from our very first site reliability chat. So kind of excited to talk about this one. So we had talked about how there were issues with the medical system, with the electronic records medical system at the VA hospitals in Spokane, in North Idaho, and a little bit in, I think, Wyoming, where these.
Ohio.
No, Idaho, not Ohio. Oh, was it? It wasn't Ohio.
Yeah, there was like the thing in Ohio as well. Yeah.
It's always a joke that when I say I'm from Idaho, people always come back with Ohio. So I thought Jason was being funny this morning, but he was not. So
no, if I was being funny, I would say it also was in Iowa.
You just said Ohio, Jason. And with that, though, this was actually a pretty big deal. There was an outage of medical records. This actually meant that people in the VA hospital, it affected their treatment. So the update from this is now the VA Medical Center. So Spokane, Washington was the first rollout location. This is a 10-year program to actually, Jason, move away from open source, the open source Veterans Health Information System technology architecture, or
I gotta say it, like 10 years.
10 years.
If nothing says waterfall, like a project that's 10 years long, man.
I mean, at least they had it right. It was a migration, right? Anybody that says you can complete a migration in 1 year, just add a zero. That was a joke we used to always make at PagerDuty. But this is to migrate the VA and the Department of Defense data to the Cerner built cloud system. Long story short, it's not working very well, and problems have been persisting consistently. And so what some of the senators are saying is, okay, we're going to stop. We need to stop this upcoming launch that's happening in Walla Walla, because there's been reports, so many reports, and I'll share some links to those. One of these is really interesting because it has to do with actually the ticketing processes and some of the underlying factors. I think there were 3 that were identified due to this. So Jason, I'm going to get a link to this report posted. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
This is the second of 3 reports that was published. And in this particularly, there were actually more than just the 3, but it basically boiled down to the ticketing system was unreliable, partly because they found that staff were resolving tickets before they were actually being resolved. They weren't communicating to users that the tickets were being set as resolved. And then the third one, or I think it might have been 4th in the list that I noticed, was a complaint that medical staff were creating workarounds basically to not have to use the system. And that was interesting to me because we often talk about reliability and resiliency being socio-technical, right? There's people and there's technology. And so this idea of this is a problem that people are creating workarounds is like, that's not actually a problem. That's what people are supposed to do. And so it's always that we say that if that's happening, you have to look at what are the motivating factors and reasons behind this, right? People don't just create workarounds because they want to do extra work. Like, people would love to use the tool, but something's very clearly wrong with the tool and very clearly wrong. And the process gives them that freedom. And so they're going to go with the path of least resistance that helps them get their job done and accomplish their goals. And so that to me was the biggest standout in this.
I think that, to me, there were a couple of pretty big ones too, in the fact that, so people were feeling ticket fatigue because they were feeling abandoned. They weren't hearing back from their tickets. They were just going into a black hole. So actually, as far as heroes for the week, congratulations to those folks who actually did the right thing and found workarounds, because people's lives are at stake in a situation like this. So do what you need to do to save people's lives. And if it means that you're not putting in a ticket and you're finding another way to do it, good job. Because sometimes we have to make quick decisions in absence of data or whatever, and we just kind of have to go with our gut, and that can be hard and it can be a risk. One of the other interesting things that I think that is coming out of this, though, is that the VA and Cerner are also going to be investigating the cause of this, and the Department of Veterans Affairs and medical records company Cerner will perform a full root cause analysis to establish an action plan to prevent further outages and issues affected by the software bug. So since the migration is going to take 10 years, I'm wondering, first of all, how long this root cause analysis is going to take, and whether or not we're going to get the information from it. Like, will there be a public postmortem? Probably not, folks. We will keep following this story to let you know. But more so, what are those fixes going to be moving forward from that? And I would like to point out that this was our first site reliability chats. So this has been going on for a few weeks. So this happened on March 3rd, which is when the system was taken offline. Jason, there are still 5 medical records that are impacted because the data got all jumbled up in this migration and it impacted folks' medical records. I mean, some of the things that were occurring with this was that prescriptions were just disappearing. Nurses were actually able to write prescriptions without doctors being involved. That one, I'm not sure if I want to clap that workaround or not. I always thinking that checks and balances are great here. But again, we're talking about life-saving issues, and that's where we're moving in technology. You know, whether or not we're talking about GitHub going down for 13 minutes, the impacts that may have to protests of war, whatever it is that you're protesting, to medical records and people not being able to get the treatment that they need. Reliability is the key focus of everything. And I think, Jason and I were also kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole of what does this mean? And we were talking about some of the things from SRE Conf that Jason was at, where folks were talking about where does the government regulation come in now with reliability?
Yeah, it's interesting because the government, not just the US government for us in the States, but I think all governments around the world have a tendency to look at reliability and root cause in very different ways than we do in the industry. In some respects, it's just because they lag behind. In others, it's because they're built on systems where they don't understand that the embrace of failure is normal, right? The SRE principle that failure is inherent in our systems. And so it oftentimes, the root cause analysis comes down to who can we blame, who can we fire, and who can we punish. So it'll be interesting as we follow this story to see how they deal with this and what the end results are. I got to be honest, Julie, I'm not super confident given that it is a 10-year program that's doing making a lot of poor choices, or so it seems right now. But we'll stay tuned.
Yeah, we will. And like I said, we'll keep you updated. And if there's anything you'd like us to talk about on this show, or interesting reliability related incidents, fixes, innovations, do let us know, because we are always looking to talk about how our world is now impacted by the reliability of the internet. And you know, we talk about that a lot with chaos engineering. That's what we're trying to do, is identify these weaknesses ahead of time. And with all of the things that we have talked about today, could they have been better prepared by practicing, by having a proactive practice there? And I just think it's interesting. I think we could go on all day long to talk about it. I do want to point out that we are just coming up on time. So please, folks, smash that like button. Always, I know I sound, it's what all the YouTubers say. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the algorithms. But we are always looking for awesome things to talk about. I don't think we have any interesting holidays, Jason, coming up. You know, we've had St. Patty's Day, we've had Pi Day. April Fools. April Fools is coming up here soon. Mm-hmm. So if you've got any great April Fool's jokes that are appropriate to share with us that you think we should play on our coworkers or company, please do let us know. Jason, any other closing thoughts?
As you think of those April Fool's joke, chaos engineering should not be one of them.
Yes, no, it should not. And so with that, we will see you next Wednesday, close to 9 a.m. Pacific time. And thank you all. Have a great day.